Okay, so we're going to dive into behavior now. And as you can imagine, behavior is relatively complicated. Uh, I guess at least in comparison to a wide variety of things out there. So this is just a simple little diagram where the purpose of the show is that the product of behavior obviously is going to be related to both genetic and environmental causes. So genetic are going to be sort of phylogenetically related or evolutionarily related, as well as through different types of selection processes. As well as going to be related to environmental contributors. So things that are going to be related to experience and learning. These two are going to sort of sum together to produce behavior. But one of the important things that I sort of add in here are going to be arrows going in both directions, both from environmental to genetic and genetic into environmental, because one important component that we can't forget about is that it's actually a two-way street here, that there's a lot of interaction going on, or what we call gene by environment interaction. So behavior is not just going to be, in any case, genetic or environmental or learned. There's going to be a consistent combination between the two of them. And sometimes behaviors that are experienced within a lifetime can end up having sort of important and consequential effects on the way that the genome is actually expressed. These will be different types of epigenetic types of effects, as well as an individual's genetics in a certain way might predispose them to experience certain kinds of environments. So we can't really treat any of these in any type of isolation at any particular given point, or else that'll just be generally wrong. But it's also not wrong to focus on certain parts at certain different types of times. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about, particularly when it comes to classical conditioning, is going to be phylogenetic-based behaviors, or behaviors that are going to be more genetically driven, because classical conditioning inherently involves some type of reflexive behavior. And these reflexive behaviors a lot of times are going to come with us without a lot of environmental experiences modifying them. But the way that we respond is going to come through environmental experiences or different kinds of learning effects that are going to change the way that we respond to certain stimuli based off of genetically pre-programmed kinds of reflexes. As you'll find out, it's inherently more complicated than that. But what's important to think of contextually is that no behavior is individually genetic nor individually environmental. In reality, it's going to be a combination of these two factors working together that's going to produce our complicated behavior that we see. So we'll be talking about things that are more phylogenetic and more learned or environmental, but don't construe that as meaning that one is sort of genetic, one is environmental. All we'll be doing is sort of changing the level at which we look at things, or the way that we kind of analyze a certain behavior. And that comes into importance when we talk about Tinbergen's 4 questions. So Nico Tinbergen, sort of Tinbergen's, hence the Tinbergen's 4 questions, had a really nice sort of way of kind of putting out that there are different levels of analysis when we're trying to understand things. So when we're trying to understand behavior, we really have 4 different types of questions that we can be asking. 2 of them are what we call ultimate, and these are going to be evolutionary-based questions. So what is the adaptive function or fitness of this particular type of behavior? And then there are other questions that we would call proximate, and these are going to be more related to what is the actual mechanism of this behavior, as well as how does this develop through learning in an individual's lifetime. So our phylogenetic questions are really going to ask, like, and I have a picture of a wolf here, they're going to be more of a comparative approach. So what is the difference between our dogs and our wolves, or some type of dogs and coyotes, or wolves and coyotes, comparing different animals to understand what is the evolutionary history of this particular type of behavior. The second question is going to be about adaptive significance. So adaptive significance is going to sort of question, how has this sort of influenced an individual's fitness or evolutionary fitness? How has this led to reproductive success in this species' evolutionary history? So we can think about these things as, what does it actually functionally do for the individual that has led to improved fitness? Now, our approximate mechanisms, or approximate questions, are going to ask, first off is going to be sort of mechanism. So these are going to be mechanistic questions, like what are the actual individually grained kind of things that are happening that is leading to the production of this behavior. So what is the hormone levels at? What are the pheromones that are around? What are going to be sort of the neuroscientific interpretations of the very precise things that are happening that is then triggering this particular type of behavior? Or what might be an individual stimulus that is then triggering this type of behavior? So these are going to be more mechanistic approaches. And then ontogeny is going to look at, well, how does this behavior develop within an individual's lifetime? How does learning and environmental experience come to change sort of the way that this individual responds within their lifetime? And we call these sort of the proximate questions because they occur more within an individual's lifetime, whereas the ultimate questions occur within the species sort of evolutionary history. Now, the really important thing to take away from this is that neither of these questions are more important than another. What rather this is reflecting is that there are different levels of questions, and that these different levels of questions, and not levels in terms of hierarchies, but different types of questions that you would want to ask to better understand a particular behavior. So no single one of these is the correct question to ask, and none of these is the incorrect question to ask. All of these are relevant, but they sort of look at different, they lead you to look at different potential causes of behavior. And this is important to sort of understand, well, I might be looking at something from an ontogenetic perspective, or how this behavior learns or develops, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an adaptive significance or an important question about the evolutionary fitness of this behavior. It just might mean that I might not be looking at this particular level at this particular time. So it's okay to look at different levels, and traditionally different disciplines of sort of studies of animal behavior have been more focused on one level or another, because that's just what happens to interest that particular type of area. So some people might have a natural inclination to be more interested in the ultimate questions, some more interested in the proximate questions. But what's important is that these are all just different questions or different levels of analysis to better understand our animal behavior. So why do we sort of bring this up? And part of that is because there are these different levels that we can look at things, and they're all inherently interacting with one another to some degree. So we have some behaviors that are going to be more driven by, or perhaps a more appropriate analysis might be looking at these ultimate questions or these evolutionary questions. And these behaviors tend to be less flexible, meaning that there isn't much the environment is going to change about them. So a good example of these are going to be reflexes, taxis, and kineses, as well as fixed action patterns. Then we can also have things or behaviors that tend to be a bit more flexible, or influences that within an individual's lifetime can substantially change that behavior. And one of the sort of bigger ones of that is going to be operant conditioning down here in the bottom. And we're going to spend a lot of time in operant conditioning, as well as also Pavlovian conditioning, which is what we're talking about as the focus of this particular types of lessons. So we can also construe learning as a type of plasticity. So learning is a way to modify an individual's behavior within a lifetime that might improve their overall fitness for whatever type of environmental situations that they are experiencing at that time. So some types of innate behaviors, and I don't necessarily like the word innate here, it's just a kind of convenient way to try and express that what we're talking about here are going to be behaviors that are less flexible to change through simple learning processes. And some major categories of these are going to be kineses, so changes of the speed of different kinds of random movements in responses to environmental stimuli. So you can think about this as some type of individual that is engaging in a random movement until all of a sudden a particularly attractive stimulus occurs, and then you change sort of the speed of random movement based off of experiencing that particular type of environmental stimulus. Taxis are going to be more about directed movement towards or away that particular stimulus, where kinesis is just going to be changes of that speed of random movement. And a reflex is what we're going to be responding or discussing mostly today, are going to be movements of a body part in response to some particular type of stimulus. You can generalize this reflex a little bit more. You can add in different types of behavioral components, but generally speaking, some type of reflex is going to be some type of behavioral action that is going to be tied to a particular eliciting stimulus. So examples of reflexes is going to be something like over here, a pupil dilation in response to a change of light, or a blink reflex when you have a puff of air towards your eye. These are going to be responses that tend to be one-to-one, or that there's a high probability of this stimulus eliciting this particular type of response. And we use usually the word elicit in these cases because it sort of reflects how I guess strongly the tie is to a particular stimulus leading to this particular type of behavior. So we can say thunder might elicit a startle response, or a light elicits some type of pupil retraction. This is going to be these sort of more phylogenetically based things, meaning that you don't really have to learn your sort of knee kick response, or you don't need to learn to dilate or to contract your pupil based off of different types of lights exposures, or that when there's a particular puff of air or something approaching your eye, to engage in some type of blink response. These things largely come on board because they have really important sort of survival components. But that doesn't mean to say that there's no sort of modification or learning things that can go on in relationship to these particular types of reflexes. And reflexes aren't necessarily a simple one-to-one type of behavior, meaning that there's not necessarily one stimulus to one very simple reflexive response, like a knee kick or an eye blink. We can have things that are called like fixed action patterns, which are going to be more complex types of responses that when a particular stimulus releases this behavior, what we call a sign stimulus releases this behavior, there's a pattern of responses that go on until there's completion of that particular response. So the little drawing or image here, I guess video probably is the more appropriate word, is showing sort of the goose here. When it notices that there is an egg outside of the nest, it engages in this sort of egg rolling response with its neck. It sort of rolling this egg back to the nest area. Once the sort of goose sees this particular type of sign stimulus, it releases the behavior even if the egg is taken away. So even though in the second video, the egg is removed from the picture, it continues that response all the way until completion, or all the way back into the nest, even though the egg isn't actually there. So it's thought that this isn't necessarily a learned behavior in the sense that they are doing it to get the egg back, but rather seeing an egg rolling out from the nest is such an important biologically related behavior that the animal will engage in this even when the egg is taken away here. And you can imagine that probably through the evolutionary history, there hasn't really been much importance to people stealing eggs right as they're trying to roll it back. So it probably hasn't had any importance to not be adaptive to whether the egg is actually present or not, such that simply having this response when they see the egg is sufficient to complete whatever the actual bringing the egg back to the nest. So fixed action pattern is a sequence or chain of behaviors that's typically set off by a specific stimulus. The component response sort of are repeated almost identically with each presentation of the stimulus. So as you saw, that behavior rolling the egg back to the nest was pretty much identical every single time that it happened, partially because the video was on loop, but generally speaking, it's typically a highly sort of what we call stereotypic response, or a very repetitive in the sense that it's very similar across all individuals of that species, and every time that that behavior engages, it's a very similar type of behavior. And fixed action patterns are typically, quote unquote, here based on a genetic blueprint. We use that necessarily loosely, but the environment simply sort of initiates the sequence. So these are going to be reflexes that are a bit more complex, so not a simple knee jerk or an eye blink, but are going to be sequences of behaviors. And typically there's just a simple signal or a sign stimulus that triggers that behavior to go on through that chain until completion. There's also more complicated sort of variations of this, like a reaction chain where it requires certain different types of stimuli to occur to sort of go on to the next component of that particular types of behavior. We won't go too much into that, but what the point of this is that there are different kinds of behaviors that have very important sort of reflexive components and sort of important sort of phylogenetic components, meaning that there have been evolutionary advantages for these particular types of behaviors, which means that they come largely on board with relatively little learning as a part of them. So we can have reflexes within here that we've largely been talking about as our unconditioned reflexes. Largely, these are going to be sort of those phylogenetic-based behaviors that we were just talking about. But then we can also have sort of conditioned or conditional reflexes, which are going to be more through ontogenetic mechanisms or learning within an individual's lifetime. And this is basically what is Pavlovian conditioning. And that is going to be our topic of focus for largely the rest of this set of lessons.